All right, good cop, bad cop. Brian, are we good to go? Okay, so welcome. This is our endorsement interview for Multnomah County Commissioner District 2. We are joined by Commissioner Sushila Jayapal and Elizabeth Taylor, correct?
Yes.
Well, thank you both for being here. We're going to start out with just try to keep it to a minute or less intro, short introduction, who you are and why you're running for this position. We'll start with you, Commissioner.
Great, thank you. Sushila Jayapal. I am the Commissioner for District 2, North and Northeast Portland. I ran the first time, because of my concern about income inequality, displacement, housing houselessness. 1 year into my term, we entered a pandemic, and that pandemic has only exacerbated all of the reasons that I ran in the first place. So I am running to continue the work that I began and to continue to serve the members of the district.
Thanks. Go ahead.
My name is Elizabeth Taylor. You can call me Liz. I have been involved in, I should just say I am homegrown. I grew up born in 1954 in Northeast Portland. My family's final resting place, as far back as I can trace my ancestors. My oldest ancestor was born in 1872, and their final resting place is at both Willamette Cemetery and Lincoln Memorial Cemetery. I grew up through busing in North and Northeast Portland. I've grown up through Model Cities program, North and Northeast Portland. I've grown up in the popular historical AME church community where our leaders were people like Charles Jordan and Edna Robinson, and my background has always been in political science, Portland State University. In fact, this is one of the first projects that I worked on that has my name published in it. I did the research. I don't know if you've seen it before. I did the research single-handedly because at that time you didn't have computers. We didn't have computers. So I had to go through the census tracts.
Okay, wow.
And that's the only copy. In fact, when I first did my statement for the ballot, I could not find this book. It had just completely disappeared. So it has mysteriously reappeared at Portland State a couple of weeks ago. So
this is wonderful.
I'm hanging on to it.
Of course.
But anyway, that's how I found out about what was going on with the true story of blacks in Oregon. And once I got involved with that, from Portland State, I worked in the Oregon legislature for 2 legislative sessions with Senator Bill McCoy, who was the first black senator in the state of Oregon. From there, I have been involved in a lot of civic activities and civic groups, and my profession for money started with Xerox after college, because that was just the bottom line. I was on National Defense Student Loan, and if you don't know anything about the National Defense Student Loan, that money has got to be paid back. And you get no credit scores, you have nothing until that money is paid back. So I went through that process of just working in corporate America, selling technology, I started off with copiers, as a matter of fact, and ended up with Yellow Book, Yellow Pages.
What would be your focus if you were elected?
Well, if I was elected, my focus would be on education, seniors, working with senior citizens, housing the homeless, focusing on mass incarceration, how to rehabilitate our youth, whose minds is a terrible thing to waste. Everybody knows that a child's mind is not developed yet. But when you take a child, when you take a child that's been literally traumatized by a beast called gentrification, okay? The kids are directly affected by that and displaced. And then you put them in a foreign area, and then You put them in classrooms where they're traumatized again by people that don't look like them. And then you take them through the system and you arrest them for things like riding public transportation with no money, trying to get from grandmama's house to auntie's house, from southeast to northwest, or from southeast to northeast. These kind of things traumatize a child. So there are, I believe that many of our youth, our at-risk youth and low-income youth can be rescued and be rehabilitated and can work, if given the opportunity, a second chance to work within a community that cares about these kids. As far as senior citizens, the health care, I just came out of a health care situation, and I'm telling you, it's personal experience. I'm just appalled at the way that senior citizens are being treated once they are picked up by the ambulance and taken to a hospital and dumped in an emergency room for 4 or 5 hours until there's a hospital bed made available, versus something as simple as an ambulance carrier saying, well, listen, we're not going to be able to get you care for at least 3 or 4 hours.
Could you be a little bit more specific about how you might address something like, gentrification in schools or, senior health care?
The way that I would address, how would I address gentrification? Mm-hmm. First of all, I would look at the school system within the communities, okay? When you look at the school systems within the community and you determine, you figure it out systematically, because I thought about this long and hard. And the way that gentrification takes place, number one, is through the school system. Once kids, because that's how it happened in the first place, once kids are bussed out of their neighborhoods, they usually do not return. They're bussed out of their neighborhood to go to elementary school. Then they go to the feeder high schools from those elementary schools, and they never return back to the community of which they were born and raised. So one of the things that I think would be an excellent idea is to take Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School and start a model schools program, teaching from a cultural text. I'm sure Shashila would agree with me that once you teach a child in the way they'll grow and they'll not depart from that. Okay, and it takes a village, doesn't it? It takes a village to raise a child. So when you have a child, your offspring, for example, and you raise them according to your traditions, because you want your child, when your child comes out of high school, you want your child to be ready to meet the world, right? Wouldn't you agree? So as a result of that, when you can raise a child in an environment that's conducive to learning versus conducive to making that child feel out of place. This is one of the main reasons. This information has been buried. This is the only book available. I did the research single-handedly. It took me, I guess, about 3 years, every single term was a work study, even in the summertime. Just going statistic. And I didn't know what I was doing at first. But when I finished, it told a story. It takes a village to raise a child. It showed a pattern of nursing in those days, from like the 50s to the 70s. Nursing was one of the #1 industries that black females could excel in. You didn't even have black teachers. You didn't even have black teachers in those days. My grandmother, who I was named after, Magnolia Elizabeth Taylor, was she was from the South, but they all moved here in 1941.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have to ask some questions about policy or we're going to move in a slightly different direction. Could you point, please, Commissioner, to a policy you've passed in the past 4 years that you think has most benefited your constituents?
As I'm sure that you know, in terms of passing policy at the county, our scope on policy is far narrower than obviously the legislature and the city as well. So, I think what I'll talk about is work that I've done that's translated into policy. It's not necessarily an ordinance that the county has passed or something like that. One of my focuses coming into office, and I'm sure I talked about it the last time I was here, in terms of houselessness. I came in really advocating for long-term rent assistance as a crucial strategy. It's hard to remember now when we're all talking about rent assistance in a variety of different contexts. At the time, long-term rent assistance, like a federal housing voucher program, was not really part of the mix. And part of the reason it wasn't the mix was because we didn't have a local funding stream for it. So came in advocating for long-term rent assistance, wrote an op-ed, brought board briefings about it, and then worked on the Metro Supportive Housing Services measure. And that gave us, for the first time, our funding stream for long-term rent assistance. So that is where, and I remember advocating for it at the legislature, and the perspective at that point was we create affordable housing by building it, which is absolutely true, but the other way we create affordable housing is by buying down rent and subsidizing it for folks. So I'm really pleased with the work that I and my office have been able to do on that. I think that's one of the policies. I think also related to housing houselessness, rent assistance, but specifically the COVID impact. When we started putting out rent assistance, as the federal funding came in for the pandemic, it was pretty clear that we were going to need a whole bunch of additional strategies on top of providing rent assistance to keep people in their housing. We had an eviction moratorium for a period of time, and there was a robust debate at the commission about whether or not to continue that. I pushed really hard to continue it because I thought that we could see that we weren't getting the rent assistance out fast enough, that we weren't reaching people, that there were still too many people who didn't even know that we had rent assistance available. So felt it was important to continue it. Now, I didn't have the support of my colleagues to keep the moratorium in place, but I think that the advocacy that I did to push the moratorium moved us to develop a much more robust system around eviction protection.
When would you have wanted to extend the moratorium until? Did you have a specific date?
I don't know that there's a perfect right answer to that. I was advocating for extending it until I'm blanking for a second, but the February date of the state's legislation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. That was my lunch.
Well, I hate to get between you and your lunch. But I think so. To go back, your question was, what's the policy that's been passed? We simply, if you watch a bunch of Multnomah County board meetings, we're not passing ordinance changes very often at all. I think the work is really about advocating for the strategies that we want to see implemented.
I think I know the answer to this already, but I'm going to ask both of you anyhow. I would love to know where each of you stand on the People for Portland ballot measure or initiative that's been introduced that would redirect homeless services funding to immediate shelter, or the vast majority of it anyway.
Yeah, I'm opposed to it. For a couple, I'll mention a couple of reasons in particular. First, thinking about setting aside the specifics of the measure, 75% of the funding, they want 75% of the funding from the measure to go to emergency shelter. The push behind the measure is the notion that emergency shelter is going to be both effective at solving houselessness and faster. I think if I dig down to what's driving this push, it's the idea that it's going to be faster, and that therefore it's going to have more immediate impact on what we're seeing in terms of houselessness. I don't believe either that it's going to be effective or that it's going to be faster. In other words, the solution to houselessness is housing and the services needed to stabilize people in the housing. We need some amount of emergency shelter, and so I have advocated for strategic expansion of shelter, and by that I mean if there's a part of the city where we don't have some, let's put some there. Arbor Lodge in North Portland is an example. If there's a kind of shelter we don't have, safe parking, let's create it. Advocated for safe parking, we're going to have a site in Sunderland. So that's what I mean by strategic expansion, but the notion that we should move from a strategy that actually solves houselessness to a strategy that will divert funding. It would be a different story if we had unlimited financial and human resources, but we don't. And I'm going to pause on human resources for a second because we are struggling to fill the shelters that we have now. So I don't think it's effective in terms of solving the problem.
You're certainly struggling to staff the shelters you have.
That's what I mean. Yes, thank you for the correction. I mean staff, not fill. It's not an effective solution. It's not faster. And if you watch the trajectory of building any of the shelters that we have around the city, it is not fast to find a place to put them, and it's not fast to build them. It's not cheaper. If you look at the studies that have been done around the cost of subsidizing rent and providing supportive services and paying for the operating costs of shelter, it's not cheaper. So it's not effective, it's not faster, it's not cheaper. That's not the right strategy. There needs to be some amount. Fixing what that amount is, setting aside whether I think 75% is the right amount, I don't, I think it's too much. The idea of fixing in statute the amount, the sort of allocation of funding that should go to shelter versus housing also strikes me as misguided. It'll leave us in a very sort of inflexible and there are a couple of other pieces of the ballot. The oversight provisions as well. They are asking for an oversight committee that doesn't, as I understand it, that doesn't include people with a financial interest in something. Not sure how they define that. At some point, everyone at one of our stakeholder tables has some financial interest in the outcome of this conversation, right? Businesses have a financial interest in the outcome of the conversation. So it doesn't strike me as a criteria that we can really apply. And it also, the thrust seems to be to lead us to a place where we don't have service providers participating in creation of the structure. We wouldn't create a hospital system without including doctors and care providers in the structure of that system. So the idea that we're going to create and operate a system without including the people who have the expertise in the system also strikes me as misguided. And I could go on for a while,
but I'd like to ask you the same question.
I'm against it, okay? My philosophy is just complete. My whole idea about homelessness is just radical, I guess. It is inhumane for humans to live outside, period. It's inhumane for humans to live outside. I can see the work that's being done to help those people that want to be helped to come inside from out in the cold, okay? But I could also see the criminal side of it, which is more prevalent, that makes our residents and our taxpayers unsafe. I don't believe in pumping and plugging money into a homeless population that wants to be homeless. Okay? It's just inhumane. Kids can't walk to school, okay? The population, birds, I live right off Marine Drive, okay? Right at Delta Park. I pass Delta Park coming and going every day. And the birds, that's a bird flyway. That's a flyway. Okay, the geese can't even land there now. I mean, I'm driving home a couple days ago, and here's a lady, balancing herself on a brick to be able to release herself.
So how would you approach homelessness?
The way I would approach homelessness is right, and I'm not saying that, I know it's not an easy fix, because you're going to constantly have people that are going to go against the grain, that will fight against the grain. And I know there's probably drug cartels out here that got to be dealt with, okay?
So what would your approach be?
So my approach would be, number one, is to go back, and fund the police department again, is to go back and fund the criminal justice system again, is to provide grants and scholarships for students to study, to be able to study and learn about mental illness, to learn about the illness of drugs, and how it affects the community, and how it affects people, and learn about new innovative ways on how to correct some of the social problems that are causing these issues in the first place. I mean, it's deeper than just taking this person randomly and putting them in a temporary shelter and giving them so many thousands of dollars, okay? And then what happens next year? You see, I'm against that. That's a revolving door.
Do you support more temporary emergency shelter, long-term affordable housing, which obviously is a longer investment? Are you somewhere in the middle?
I'm somewhere in the middle of that, because I believe long-term affordable housing doesn't have to be long-term affordable housing. Long-term affordable housing could quickly turn into generational wealth if our policies and our government policies and thought process would see that direction. See, you have to see it. You have to see it. You have to realize it. You just can't go along with the status quo and say, okay. Some things you have to just think out of the box. Let's just say, what if we just stopped doing that? There are areas in our district, in District Number 2, where you don't have homelessness. People, the neighbors will not putting up with it. You don't have homelessness. You don't have people. You don't have people stealing. You might have one or two people on the street. Mississippi, for example. Okay, you don't have a whole bunch of shooting and gang. See, all this criminal element works together, and it's got to. I mean, it's more than just a home. You know, you can't isolate homelessness from crime, from drugs, from the highest high school dropout rate in the nation. This all works together, and by working together, we have to think systematically. You have to understand how it began in the first place, okay? And then let's go back and fix it.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Liz, why do you think you would make a better commissioner than Commissioner Jayapal?
You know, I respect Commissioner Jayapal. Jayapal,
yeah.
I respect Commissioner Jayapal, and based upon the fixes that I see, she hasn't touched any of them in the last 4 years, and for whatever reason. And I think there's been plenty of opportunity. There's been plenty of opportunity there to be able to make a change in education. There's been plenty of opportunity there to fund grants and scholarships for health care for senior citizens. There's been plenty of opportunity. I mean, just looking at the city of Portland, which is encompassed inside of the county, and you know, we look at and working with, you know, the county working with the city on certain issues. I just don't see why they can't work together. For example, what's killing me right now is as I research the city and the county, we should be working closer together, because I'm going to tell you what got me. 9,900 nonprofit agencies in the city of Portland alone, to the tune of $8 billion a year.
Commissioner, do you want to respond to what Liz has said and say why you think you would be best for this position?
So, you know, I started talking about some of the things that I think I've influenced and accomplished on housing and houselessness, two that I mentioned. In addition, thinking about all of the pieces of our system that have to address housing and houselessness, have advocated and secured funding in the budget last year for additional outreach and navigation services and hygiene services. So when I think about houselessness, I start with the creation of affordable housing in those two ways, the services that we need to move people into housing, and then addressing conditions on the street. And what I've done with my time on the commission is to advocate for each of those solutions. You know, I also think back and remember that I started in January of 2019 and we headed into a pandemic in 2020. And where I focused my attention during the pandemic was to make sure that we were really focused on providing services for the communities that were most impacted. So looking at data, looking at access to testing, looking at vaccines, making sure that Black, Indigenous, and people of color were getting access to those services. that, in addition to securing the funding, which I think was about a $2 million amendment to the budget, which was significant in terms of how we do our budget process and the influence that commissioners have. I have and will continue to deliver constituent services. I think that's something that's undervalued. But I have close relationships with the neighborhoods and with communities in my district, and will continue to work closely with those neighborhoods to address the situations that they're seeing. I have begun work that I will carry out in the rest of my term, and that I think will have real impact. That includes serving our immigrant and refugee communities. I secured $100,000 in our last budget to start a mapping study that I think is going to lead us to establishing an Office of Immigrant and Community Affairs or something like that. And that again was responding to what I saw during the pandemic, that while ultimately our workforce did an amazing job of getting out there and getting services to folks, it exposed the fact that it took us a while to understand how to really reach our immigrant and refugee communities. And that's because we don't have a systemic way of doing it. We have committees that we populate as needs arise, but we don't have a system, and we need a system. So those are some examples of the things that I've started working on, and that I will continue and continue to work on in the second term.
All right, so
I think there was, sorry, I
Go ahead.
have one follow-up. I think there was some surprise that you didn't run for chair this cycle. Why not?
I thought hard about it. My seat is the only one that's up at the same time as the chair seat. It's coterminous with the chair seat. My colleagues can run, potentially lose, and retain their seats.
Right.
If I ran, I would be off the commission. I think this is really important work. I want to continue doing it. And I decided that the risk with all 4 commissioners running for the chair seat, the risk was fairly high of any one of us losing that seat. And I'm not ready to be off the commission. I'm not ready to be out of politics.
Have you endorsed in that race?
I have not.
Are you going to?
I have no plans to.
Do you plan to endorse in the sheriff's race?
I'm sorry?
Do you plan to endorse in the sheriff's race?
No, I do not.
Okay, so our last question is sort of a fun question.
So I keep
go for
interrupting, but Tess, did you have anything else you wanted to ask in this one?
No, I'm mostly just listening.
Okay.
I do more like criminal justice reporting, so I'm kind of.
I just figured if there were other
these two.
if there were other sheriff's questions you wanted to throw in here, that's perfectly cool.
Okay, so our kind of more lighthearted question, we're asking all candidates about what was the moment when they kind of felt like the pandemic was over, acknowledging that it's not over yet, but sort of when you felt a little bit of hope. Liz, you want to go for it?
I'm going to tell you when I walked in this room, because this is the first meeting that I've been to where I literally took off my mask. Literally. Even in the car, I wear my mask. So I feel comfortable
Cool.
in this room right now.
Nice. Commissioner?
It actually was fairly recent as well. My son got married this past weekend.
Oh, congratulations.
And it was a mask-free
Wonderful.
wedding.
Here in town, or?
No, in San Francisco.
Okay. Great.